Cool, we're live. Welcome to you millions out there eagerly hanging off at every word, wanting to listen in to the conversation we're going to have on parenting. My name is Dom. I'm the assistant pastor of Grace Church. Do you guys want to introduce yourself?
I'm Jonathan. I'm one of the elders at Grace Church.
And I'm John Orchard. I'm the pastor at Grace Church as well.
Cool. So this is our third week. The first time we asked the very vague and broad question, does it matter how we parent? And we decided, yes, it probably does. And everyone actually agrees on that, which is good. And then last week we had a look at what does the Bible say about being a parent? And the big idea there is that there is a perfect parent, God himself. He is our Heavenly Father, and we are made in his image. And that says a lot, and there's a lot to be drawn from that. And now this week we're looking at what does the Bible say about being a father and mother. And in some ways there's going to be similarities to last week, and maybe we're being a bit controversial here, don't know. But guys, Jonathan and John, what does the Bible say about being a father and a mother?
Well, again, the perfect example is God in both cases. We're used to God being referred to as the Heavenly Father. It's there in the Lord's Prayer and elsewhere. It's also in Proverbs in many places, teaching people how to parent, but also teaching children how to treat their parents, to honor the person that's caring for them and funding them, and but very importantly, training them how to be functional adults, to give them honor. And but also the Lord in a number of places is referred to as a mother, particularly a nursing mother. We've got Psalm. One of the Psalms of Ascent, where David talks about being able to be at peace because he is like a weaned child on its mother's knee. So giving the impression that here's this mighty warrior, this king, but God to him was like his mother when he was a little child. There are lots of things he wouldn't understand, lots of things he wasn't in control of. But if he was in God's embrace, he could relax and be at peace. So again, both are there. That it may be controversial just to point out the imagery is different. There is a fatherly way to parent, and there is a motherly way to parent, and sometimes for various reasons, one parent will have to play both roles, which is phenomenally difficult. But it's just worth noticing they are described in different ways there.
Thanks, John. Just on a practical note, please would you change your setting to speaker view so that whoever's talking is the one who fills the screen. That just makes my job editing a little bit easier. Thank you. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, and obviously Jesus himself, I mean, he wasn't afraid to use feminine images about himself even. I mean, he talks about just as a hen gathers her chickens under its wings, so I would gather you. I mean, that's a female image, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's clearly there's this both a male and female aspects of parenting that are very important, but clearly they're not interchangeable. They're complementary. That's the point. And God made us male and female, and intended that male and female, mother and father, husband and wife, should parent their children together. That was the ideal. Now, obviously, we live in a fallen world, and that ideal is not always attainable, and sometimes not because of our fault or anything else. But that is an ideal which is set up in the scriptures. And the Apostle Paul, who's often thought of as being quite a sort of hard character in some ways. He's just
Falsely, I might add.
Hmm?
Falsely, I might add.
Absolutely, and he's you know, I mean, he was just so loved by everybody he came into contact with in the church, and he describes himself. I was just thinking about the passage in 1 Thessalonians 2 when we were thinking about parenting, where Paul, in the same paragraph, just 3 or 4 verses apart, in 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 7, for example, he says, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you, because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. You know, you can't imagine some of these sort of macho leaders. Sometimes you can even get them in the church, don't you? Actually wanting to compare themselves with a nursing mother. There's two words for mother in the New Testament Greek, and this is the word that's used for a mother who is breastfeeding her children. And you know, it's not a macho image. It's completely the opposite of that. And it's just talking about tenderness. It's talking about looking after the very little ones. And then just 3 verses later, or 4 verses, verse 11, for you know, he says, that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. Now, of course, he's speaking here about his spiritual children, but that is, we can transfer that. It's transferable information here into how a father should act. He's using the mother and the father, nursing mother and the father, as illustrations of how he's cared for his spiritual children. And spiritual leaders need to have these different aspects, these 2 aspects, these complementary aspects in their leadership. It's part of leadership. And just as it's part of spiritual leadership, so it's part of leadership in the home, because there's tremendous comparison between a spiritual pastor and a father in a home setting. It's just the same things are said time and time again in the New Testament, particularly. But clearly, you know, you see that the mother's role for the tender infant, how she is in some ways the most important person there to begin that nurturing process. And then you can see how the father sort of comes into the picture just there. And those 3 examples of what a father should do, how a father should deal with his children. It's almost incidental, but he's saying, this is how I treated you, and encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God. I mean, that's a tremendous thing. I mean, if we had an encouraging father, if we had a father who empathized with us, who would comfort us in our need, and yet one who also was aspirational for us, urging us to live lives worthy of God. So those 3 key concepts are very much part of what a father should be. And I can imagine people listening to that would say, oh, I wish my father had been like that, or I wish as a father I was like that. But these are things that we can aspire to, and by God's grace, we can become. But also, incidentally, he is very clearly saying there are distinct roles for a mother and a father. Otherwise, he would just say, be like a parent and do these things. But he doesn't. He says, this is what a mother is like, and this is what a father is like. And it just emphasizes the importance that where it is possible, the ideal of God is that we should have a mother and a father along these lines. Now, we live in broken times, and clearly many people, and possibly those who are listening in, you know, will not be in that happy situation, not experience that themselves. And that's where God, as our Heavenly Father, with all these female aspects, comes in and takes over these roles for us. And as Christian families, as churches, and as Christian leaders, we can adopt these roles as well. We can provide healing in these situations to compensate for any lack we have in these ideal pictures that are given.
Just picking up what you're saying about the complementary nature of father and mother, as we see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, it seems to be that Paul's making the point that he doesn't want to, well, he didn't want to burden the church. And in fact, he was caring for them and carrying their burdens and in a motherly type way. But then, in contrast, and to complement that, the father image is not just carrying them, but motivating them, spurring them on to walk on their own 2 feet. Is that kind of, maybe it's a bit simplistic to simplify it like that, but is that kind of the picture?
Possibly so. I mean, it's an indication of the different roles and how those roles can be complementary. I'm sure there's a multiplicity of different ways in which that can be exhibited. And obviously every couple, every mother and father together have different strengths and different weaknesses. It will look slightly different in different situations, but there are emphases here which we can learn for. And also, you know, it's all part of the diversity which the Bible teaches in the role of man and the woman, the spiritual equality, but the diversity of function. And that applies in the relationship between husband and wife, and it applies in the relationships of father and mother as well. It's wonderfully complex, but it all works together for good, and it's all an illustration of God's care for us.
I think a few verses beforehand, it helps us understand something of this. So from verse 5, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. So there's a contrast there, isn't there? That many people in life want something from us. Either, you've got peer pressure and you've got people looking for each other's approval and affirmation, whereas your parents don't need your approval. And that, it's nice when our parents appreciate us, but that's not really what motivates us, is it? We don't need to flatter our children or anything. Maybe when they're very small and they do their painting, we say, that's really great. What we mean, it's really great for you at your stage and so far. So parents aren't, or certainly shouldn't be, looking for to flatter our children or desperate to get approval from our children. Instead, we really are on our children's sides, looking for them to thrive. And there are very few relationships in a child's life that are quite like that, aren't there? Even a teacher who I'm sure is, 90% all about just the child thriving. There are other factors for them, isn't there? There's, the exams and how the grades reflect on them. There's, they'll have commitments outside of work, other things. But for parents, if the parent is functioning properly, then they really are looking for what's best for the child, and so able to say some tough things to the child when it's in the child's best interests that a friend might never say, because they're worried about offending them, or because they just don't have the wisdom because they're a peer. And so parents are very special in that way, aren't they?
So Jonathan, go on.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And so the parents are expected to have full responsibility for their children. It is expected in the Bible that the parents know better than their children. Obviously, as they grow older, children are encouraged to have their own opinions. Of course they are. But while they are still children, the parents have a role of leadership and of authority over that. Now, authority is always one of those difficult words, but it's true, and children are expected to obey their parents. That's classic. Goes right back to the Old Testament. Certainly to honor their parents, which included the idea of obedience. It's just a broader term. and it's vital that should be the case. But there also is a great emphasis on how parents exercise that authority. One of the great things that we always find about God in the Bible, and then Jesus, and then the Apostle Paul, very, very down to earth, is the way that he always showed love first. He always says, look, I've loved you. I've shown you this great love. I've urged these things upon you. And that is what I want to do. And he says more than once, doesn't he, in his letters, I don't want to come, with a stick, as it were. I don't want to come, blaming you. I don't want to come condemning you or saying things like that. I don't want to come to judge you. I just want you. I want you to see, because of my love for you, that this is important. And that's a very important principle, isn't it? So sometimes parents can get hold of the wrong end of the stick, and there being fathers, for example, or mothers even, who are quite domineering and just demand obedience. That's the danger, isn't it? And that's never the approach of God to us at all. It's always a last resort, and even then, discipline from God is always intended to be restorative. It's never a punishment for itself. And we have to do all of these things. I'm just looking at another verse that occurs to me from Colossians chapter 3, where in verse 20 it says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. And then immediately in the following verse 21, it says, fathers, do not embitter your children. It could be exasperate your children, it could be translated, or they will become discouraged. And so it's as though the Apostle Paul there, immediately having said, children should obey their parents in everything, he wants to come in and say, well, look, that could be misunderstood. I'm bringing in a caveat here. Fathers need to, who could be in the most tempting position of imposing their strength and their dominance. Come on, you've got to be very, very careful. You must not embitter your children and frustrate them. You must be very careful how you act towards them. Otherwise, they'll be discouraged. So there's always balance, isn't there, in all of these different relationships?
Yeah.
I think something that is very relevant to parenting in 2020 is, and with this dynamic of fathers and mothers, is that marriages, and I know that that's not always the case, but parents and marriages is supposed to be one united life, isn't it? It's not two separate lives who seem to be going in parallel in most of things. It's not just sharing a bank account. It's about having a shared life, and parenting is part of that united life, and children need both fathers and mothers. I think I don't want to be like an old fogey like Jonathan, who and the type of people who are always talking down about the young generation and the youth of today, and how they become like this. But in all honesty, I think there have been adverse effects caused by a lack of a father and a mother. Now, I'm not going to be specific, and I don't really know what I mean by that, but I'm convinced that God has made us in such a way that we're best nurtured and brought up in homes where there is a solid father figure and a solid mother figure, and that is the way that God intended it to be. Fulfilling the different roles, I think, is also relevant in terms of maybe there are fathers but who aren't living out what it means to be a father. So a father who's always working all the time and not there or available for their children. I think there's, again, mothers who opt out in whatever way. We were talking last week about parents who've outsourced some of the parental roles, and that's just what we do in society these days. So a lot of our teaching we outsource to schools, teaching the Bible to Christian families. Maybe we outsource some of that to Sunday school and things like that. And it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as we see it as supplementing what is going on in the core family. But I think
there's a lot of evidence statistically now, even in secular circles, of the consequences of there being absent fathers, for example, in situations, and particularly the effect that has upon boys being brought up in the family. And I certainly read an article recently, I can't remember at one moment, but where it was just showing the statistics on that. about boys experiencing problems and difficulties and so on. And there was absolutely no Christian element in this at all. It was just supposed to be objective sort of child studies. But I mean, having said that, I would think an absent father is better than a present father who's really abusive, obviously, and who's not doing a job as it should be in the home. But and you have to feel sorry for, particularly for single mothers, because it tends to be single mothers much more than single fathers, obviously. But the task is so much more difficult for a single mother to, when you look at the biblical pattern, how difficult it is for a single mother to be able to provide, both sides of what's needed in a relationship according to the way that we were created. So I always have tremendous sympathy for mothers who on their own are bringing up their children, because their task is far, far harder than it was meant to be.
Yeah. And as Jonathan says, there is a huge amount of evidence out there these days. So much so that it's no longer an argument in academic circles. It's one of the best things you can do to encourage your child to succeed is to stay together as parents and parents together. And one thing that is worth just spelling out clearly is that marriage primarily is for the good of the children. I love being married. It's I enjoy it very much. It's good for me. I trust it's good for Catherine as well. But the whole way in which marriage is traditionally framed and organized is so that the next generation will get the best possible start it can. That's why, historically sex was always kept to within marriage, because you don't want children appearing who aren't going to be supported and encouraged and helped by both parents in a committed relationship that's legally binding and has all the supports of the community and so on and so forth. So just the number of pastoral conversations that I have with people who are suffering in major ways, who can trace it back to the fact that their parent, that one parent or the other walked out on them, and usually it's fathers, or just weren't available for them in their formative years. So we may kid ourselves, the child is fine, they've got a good school, that's their mother's job, or something like that. But you chat to someone who's one of their parents weren't emotionally and physically available to them in their formative years, and they will tell you that it was a big loss and that it has affected them. That's not to say things can't be mitigated by community, but if you're someone whose marriage is in trouble, please do work at it really, really hard. If you're thinking of starting a family, make sure that you are committed to each other and you thought seriously about what is involved. And I'm happy to sit down and chat to anyone if they want to get in touch after this.
Yeah, and it's wonderful, isn't it, that we've got a biblical pattern here. I mean, you've got so many different voices now. I mean, you could read books on parenting till they come out of your ears, and often they're contradictory. Yeah. And there's this guru here and that guru there telling you exactly what to do, and you think if you obey somebody to the letter, then it's going to work out. Nobody, has all of the answers, and some of the answers are really very unhelpful. But how wonderful it is that you can turn to the Bible, where God, who designed us as we were, created us as we were, male and female, to be parents of children. I mean, the one who actually made us. I mean, following the Maker's instructions is always a good idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to think that we can go right back to the Maker's instructions in the Bible, and we don't have to worry about all these people who have completely, I don't know what they're thinking of, but giving advice left, right, and centre, probably well-meaning, but often, just unfounded. And yet here we have it in the Bible. I was just thinking about what you were saying there. I read a verse or two from Colossians a moment earlier, but I'd forgotten Ephesians 6, which is Paul wrote Colossians and Ephesians about the same time, and it's got similar material in it at times. And he says a little bit in more detail what I was saying earlier. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. It's reinforcing what John was just saying about, it's for the benefit of the children. And children understanding the role of their parents is as important as, well, almost as important as parents understanding their role with the children. And if they got that right, if they understand that obeying their and living with their parents as they should, with respect and honor, is actually means that they are going to do it. It's for their benefit, just as the parents know it's for the children's benefit that they are leading in this way. And the last verse 4 says, chapter 6, verse 4 of Ephesians, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, and here's the alternative, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And that's the key thing, isn't it, for parents to take advantage of this huge resource that we have in the Bible to actually bring children up as they were intended to be brought up, as they were made to be brought up. Sometimes people think of Christianity as being some kind of cult or way of doing things, but most normal people do things differently. I mean, this is the way we are supposed to be brought up. God has made us, every creature that's ever been, and he has told us from the beginning, this is what we should do. And that's why Christian parents bring up their children in the training and instruction of the Lord. And children who understand that and respect their parents will say, what a privilege it is to be in this situation. And I just want to learn as much as I can about what it means that God loves me and wants me to be the sort of person he wants me to be. And
maybe we should say that Christians haven't always got it right, and just because someone is a Christian doesn't mean they will be a fantastic parent. But at the same time, you would want to caveat that saying you only hear the bad stories, don't you? You very rarely have people shouting from the rooftops saying, I had Christian parents and I'm so grateful for it. But you are more likely to hear the stories of my parents just were very stern and were off their rocker with all this Christian nonsense. You'll hear a lot of that, won't you, if you look for it?
Well, yeah, I mean, but that's because the parents have got this balance wrong and haven't understood it. And maybe they've suffered because their parents didn't get it right either. And so
this is probably the point. And this
Sorry?
is probably the point at which I should say, look, I had Christian parents and I am very grateful for it. So
Amen. Yeah, same. Yeah.
Well, I had non-Christian parents, and I was very grateful for them because I think it was a generation where they had imbibed Christian values, and I'm not sure, apart from deliberately taking me to the Bible and showing me things, I'm not sure they could have done much more than they did.
Great.
But the trouble is today, people are completely ignorant because their parents didn't know anything about Christianity or the Bible or whatever, and so these values have just been totally eroded. So it's even more necessary, isn't it, to talk about these things now, not as just, and the important thing is not talking about them as traditional values, but as biblical values, because that's where they come from. It's not as though we can find something better, just as in modern days things get better in certain ways technologically or whatever it is. You can't find a better way of parenting.
No. That's so boring, Jonathan. We wanted something new. We wanted some magic motto to apply to. Lockdown has been going on for a long time. Some parents, I guess, are pulling their hair out if they've got any left.
We all got too much at the moment.
Yeah, John and Jonathan, would you say just something encouraging to parents right now as maybe they're desperate for schools to return, maybe they just want grandparents to be able to take the children off their hands for a little while?
I was speaking to somebody recently about and saying, look, let's just spend time talking about all the good things that are coming out of lockdown. And I mean, a lot of them happen to center upon family life, because clearly we are spending more time, or a lot of people are spending much more time with their parents, with their children, than they ever were before, and children with their parents. So if you are in that fortunate situation, people who have been furloughed, people who, I don't know, just deciding to work from home, whatever it may be, but an awful lot of parents are spending more time with their children than before. And it'd be fantastic, wouldn't it, if that aspect can continue in some ways. I know, and to be able to spend more time with your children is a crucial thing. I think it's been one of the real perils of the kind of society we live in, that many parents, and particularly fathers, and we talk about absent fathers, they're not just fathers who have deserted the family and gone who knows where. They are fathers who spend most of the waking hours away from the home, and there's not much difference, quite frankly. So for a parent to be, a father particularly, to be present physically for a good number of hours a day is a tremendous advantage. And of course, historically, that was the case when families were much less, disintegrated than they are today, and fathers would be spending more time with their families in historical settings. So I think it's great if we can return to that. It'd be absolutely fantastic, and take advantage of that time. If you've got that time now, even if it's only temporary because of the lockdown, let's use it to bring, I think, to speak to your children, to ask them questions, about how do you think things are going in our family? Ask your children that, and you might be amazed at the insights that they give you, and they might begin to speak to you much more openly if you can really empathize with them. And children can teach us a lot. You're responsible for them and for teaching them. That's a given. But children can equally show us a lot if we listen to them, and not just to their words, but how they're responding to their emotional growth, and for us to be sensitive to their needs. And for all of those things, we need to be present, because we can't work it out unless we are. So all of those things can lead to very positive outcomes.
And how great that many parents have been able to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner on a far more regular basis with their children. And maybe you're exhausted at having to police squabbles between siblings or something like that. But the fact that you're doing that is actually an important thing. It may be that kind of teaches them to get along with other people in a key way that would have been missed otherwise.
I mean, I just put in a slight plea at this point for family prayers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I mean, I shouldn't be having to say this to Christians who are listening, but it's just a fantastic privilege to be able to pray with your wife and your children. I would say, I mean, corporate prayer, however it is in the church or whatever it is, should be primary. But I think, whatever the situation, if I had to choose between praying on my own and praying with the family, I would choose praying with the family as being more important. And fortunately, we don't have to choose, but I think that certainly would be the case. And prayer is definitely something that draws us together. And for children to recognize when a father prays with his children, that is a fantastic influence, and in my experience has led to huge respect from the children to the father, and that the father is showing that he is not the tyrant, that he is dependent upon his heavenly Father and is getting his instructions, as it were, from him. That's a fantastic reassurance, even as children grow up through teenage years, to realize it's not, oh, I know better than him. No, because it's your heavenly Father who's given the instructions. You can't say you know better than God. So, I mean, there are all sorts of spiritual, direct spiritual, and then related emotional and psychological effects of family prayer time.
Great. Well, that seems like a good place to end. We don't want these to run on too long, so they're still accessible and everyone's still awake. But thank you for joining us, and yeah, hope to see you next week when we're going to continue this conversation on a slightly different topic. Brilliant. Thanks all. God bless.